There's a lot of students of mine who want to go into investment banking, and I would tell you it's likely not cut out for most of them. There are some that it's right up their alley. They will be successful. And to be very clear, when I say successful, it means they will be able to not just hold on to, but grow in their Yiddishkeit while at the same time balancing a very, very intense work schedule. Sometimes if you've crossed the line too hard, it may be difficult to correct in the current job and you may need to go somewhere else. I spent this last week writing over 1,000 New Year's cards to my connections in the business world, and I handwrite all of these cards. I do that because it's my way of being makir tov and staying in touch, and I do believe it's a very powerful tool that most people don't utilize to enhance relationships, but also it's just important on who we are.
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shark Tank. Shark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we're joined by Laizer Kornwasser. He's the CEO of Dr. First. He's a professor at Yeshiva University at Sim School of Business, and he's the chairman of NCSY. Laizer, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Shark Tank.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
So, just briefly before we jump in, a quick personal request from listeners to please help us by leaving a 5-star review and hitting the subscribe button. It really helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. So without any further ado, Laizer, you started your career in investment banking before having a few pivots into other directions. So maybe just take us back to that early decision to go in that direction. Investment banking is considered a very intense, but also, well-paid career. So why was that your first choice of a career?
Sure. So let me just take a step back. So I went to Yeshiva University, got my master's in accounting, then spent 2 years in accounting, and then went for my MBA. Coming out of business school, I spent my summer between my first and second year at Merrill Lynch investment banking. I knew I wanted to go into real estate, and I felt that investment banking real estate would give me a good platform to be able to do that. I will tell you that before I started in investment banking, I actually took a year off, went back to teach at Yeshiva University, and then went back to learn before I jumped into the world of investment banking, which I knew would be extremely intense.
Right. And so was it as intense as stereotypes say it is?
Well, I would tell you stereotype today is a lot different than stereotype 30 years ago. Baruch Hashem, I was blessed. I joined investment banking in a unique group. I joined real estate in Merrill Lynch at a time when Merrill Lynch really controlled about 70% of the market. So we had a tremendous amount of deals, and it was a good environment for me in that I had my managing director, I had my team, and we were very productive. But there wasn't this mentality of you need to stay to midnight, you need to burn the midnight oil, regardless of whether you're being productive or not. So that allowed me to be very productive, but also to try to keep that in balance. I think today what you hear about investment banking is it's a lot more extreme. The hours are a lot more intense. Not that my hours weren't intense, but they were different.
Right. So on that last point, you're now, in addition to being a business leader, you're also now a professor. You mentor young people. So what do you think are the main differences between investment banking when you were starting out to how it is nowadays?
I guess what I would tell you is there's a lot of students of mine who want to go into investment banking, and I would tell you it's likely not cut out for most of them. There are some that it's right up their alley. They will be successful. And to be very clear, when I say successful, it means they will be able to not just hold on to, but grow in their Yiddishkeit while at the same time balancing a very, very intense work schedule. But I will tell you that is the minority. And so they really need to understand what they're stepping into. They really need to have a strong base from a Yiddishkeit perspective. For me, it was easier. I knew I was going in for 2 years or 3 years, and then I would use that as a platform to get into real estate, which I didn't get into. But at the end of the day, it really depends what you're looking at doing. If you're looking at staying in investment banking and that's going to be your Yomam V'Laila, then you really need to make sure you stay anchored and you know what your priorities are. Otherwise, it's not necessarily something that I would recommend for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem like a really big challenge. Can you give us a little bit more of a picture of what you were describing, the minority of students who actually are cut out for it? Like, what does that mean? What does it take to be able to succeed in that way of not just being able to cash the paycheck, but also to really hold on to our core values?
I mean, listen, there are very few who are able to go through investment banking and are able to ensure that they are davening with the minyan, trying to chop a chavrusa here or there, and are still growing within their Yiddishkeit as opposed to the work being so intense that it's watering them down. And so I think a lot of it depends on the background that you're coming from and how you define success. One of the things that I always talk about is what is your definition of success? So I want to be clear. My definition of success is likely different than many of my students. So I can't self impose my definition of success, but it's really important if being a good, successful Yid who's growing and thriving is part of that definition, then you really need to make sure you need to make sure you're putting yourself in a situation where that's realistic and plausible.
And you mentioned that this was like a short-term thing for you. So tell us, and you had plans to go to real estate that you alluded to the fact that it's not what ended up happening. So maybe you could take us through some of the next steps on your journey after that initial investment banking experience.
Sure, as they say, Matt, plans and God laughs. So I thought I was going to be in real estate. I thought I was going to go into family business. Ultimately, I went from investment banking. I then went to work with the person that founded Priceline.com. The internet bubble bursted. And then I wound up finding my way into a company called Medco Health right as it was about to spin out from Merck. It was a challenged company, but I felt that I'd be able to help take it on a path to success. And so we spun out from Merck. We were the problem child. Within a couple of years, we wound up being a Fortune 50 company. And I was blessed to be in a position where, because we were a spin out company and I had a CEO who was looking for talent and not necessarily seniority, as I was able to grow and take a business from, at the time, about $30 million of profitability to over 600 million within a few years, he was able to then turn around and say, I'm going to give you more authority and become a very senior person at a very young age at a Fortune 50 company.
So how young were you at that point?
I was under 35. And,
Wow.
everyone else around
And
the table were in their 50s, and it was senior corporate executives. But Baruch Hashem, I was in the right place at the right time. I was able to capitalize on it. And it was a good learning opportunity, but that's what launched me into the healthcare space.
And I'm sure it was this very special to be able to have that sort of defining experience of being rewarded for the actual results that you delivered and not being judged or limited by your age or external factors, but actually being treated, based on what you actually did for the company. I'm sure that's something you took with you afterwards also.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I learned a tremendous amount. I think through every job, I've seen good leaders and bad leaders. This was a situation where I was blessed to be surrounded by good leaders, whether it was my CEO or other people that I reported directly into, on what it means to focus is on what matters versus the nourish guide on everything else that happens in the business world.
Right. And then you mentioned sort of sitting in that room with people who are maybe a decade or 2 decades older than you with more experience. What was that feeling like? Did you feel like imposter syndrome that here I am, this young guy amongst all these much older, more accomplished people? Or was it sort of a natural transition?
So I would tell you, it wasn't necessarily a natural one. I am a thinker, so I take in and think. And I remember the CEO called me in one day and said, "You're at the table for a reason. So if you're not speaking and you're not contributing, you're not taking advantage of the seat at the table." And that was a good kick for me to sort of realize I can't just sit back. To me, the main thing was everything that I said was always based on facts. Decisions that I made were based on facts. And it wasn't about emotion and it wasn't about my kavod or my success. And I've always felt that if you stick to the facts and you stick to results, and those speak louder than words, you're in a good shape. And that's really what I did. And fortunately, others around me were able to recognize that. And there, it was a good place for me to be.
I'm wondering if on that point you have any advice, because sometimes I found myself in a somewhat of a similar situation where I'm trying to speak fact based, but the person on the other end is maybe in a much more of an emotional state of mind and much more protective of his turf and his kavod and stuff like that. So how do you project and communicate in a way to bring everyone onto that playing field? Because in the end of the day, right, the results are going to come from fact based decision making, analytical thinking and stuff like that. The person on the other side of the table is not necessarily always in that same headspace.
Yeah, so what I would tell you is when I say it's not about you, there's two things that come with it. One is you can't make success about you, but it's not about you also means you need to understand the people that you're communicating to and the people that you're representing. When it's understanding the people that you're communicating to, I always like to say the way I would communicate to my CEO is different than the way I communicate to my CFO. One is a number-based conversation. One is usually more of a strategic-based conversation. So it's really important that you change the way you communicate to the people that you're talking to. If at the end of the day, the goal is to understand and get to where you want to go, it's not about how you communicate and making sure that people adjust to the way you talk, but it's adjusting to their modes of communication so that you get to yes. So while it's always fact-based, you do need to change your tone. You do need to change how you do it based on who you're talking to.
Right. And I mean, that point about being able to put yourself sort of in the other person's shoes and be perceptive in that way. I happen to come from a marketing background, which is certainly a key insight in marketing, but it really in all of life, being able to see things from other people's perspective. And I've heard you talk about this in public forums before. It's really just a very key component to so many different things, both in our hashkafa of life, but also in our success in just navigating all these relationships and stakeholders.
Yeah, and I would also tell you that's part of, I know one of the conversations we're going to get into is the Altar of Slabodka. One of the things that is really important to me is you can be a successful leader, but you also need to be humble and you need to be able to balance the two. And if you can do that, then you have no problem looking at it from other people's perspectives versus being Guyvedic and thinking people need to revolve around you. So I think that's just sort of a balance.
Right. So we're going to get to that in a moment, but you sort of mentioned that you were quickly ended up in a very senior role and you ended up doing a lot of different things in the C-suite and executive level positions. So can you talk about your Jewish pride, your Jewish identity during those times? Was it something that you tried to keep on the down low, something that you were very open about? How was that something that you dealt with over the years?
Yeah, I mean, for me, being Jewish is who I am. It's part of my identity. It's not something that I felt I ever needed to hide, but it was the whole package. Now, I will tell you, it's really important, and I always tell people, you can't be an excuse. So it's something that you're proud of, and if anything, it means that you have to put 110% in versus trying to find the easy way out. You know, uh, you don't use it as an excuse to get away on Friday early, and you don't use it as an excuse because you can't work on the Chagim. At the end of the day, you say, how can I make up for it and over deliver as a result of that? And I found as long as I never made it an issue, it never became an issue. Now, I have had challenges associated with it, but to me, I always wore a yarmulke, never had, and really never had challenges with that. But that's who I was. I will tell you, part of that is understanding that when you come to work as a Yid, as a Jew, you're either making a Kiddush Hashem or a Chil Hashem, which is a tremendous achrayus that you have to take on upon yourself, and you have to live up to that. And that's something that you just need to keep in mind. You need to be able to do that being proud and not have any challenges. I have had challenges, but Baruch Hashem in general, most of my experiences have been great.
Great. And so he does a little more, challenges are a normal part of, this life that we all are in this podcast are trying to navigate. So he does a little more about some of the, maybe the more memorable stories of when there were challenges about your Torah, your Yiddishkeit, your values versus your work responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I had one interesting CEO. I was in a large public company, and I was one of the top three executives. So, let's call it a multi-billion-dollar company. And I had a CEO who knew a little bit about Yiddishkeit, and as a result, felt his ability that he was able to push the limit to see how much he can push. So there was one time we were working on a very large transaction, and I said, I need to go home for Shabbos. And he tells me, he goes, I just looked up the calendar and candlelighting is not to this time. You can stay for another half an hour. Mind you, I was an extremely senior executive. And I told him, I said, listen, it's not a matter of getting home for Shabbos, but I need to prepare. And so I am going to go home. If for some reason you are not happy with that, I'm happy not coming back on Monday morning. That was probably the most contentious it ever was. I will tell you, for the one challenging CEO, I've had numerous CEOs, not only who have they've gone out of their way to ensure that everything that I did was according to the way that I wanted to observe Yiddishkeit. So I will tell you, yes, we all will have challenges and you have to feel comfortable and you have to know, I'm a big believer in you need to know where you draw the line in the sand and don't cross over that. And everyone will have their own rabbanim to go to, and it's really important that you have a rav to turn to to know where you draw the line in the sand because there are many issues out there. But once you draw the line, you just got to hold to that.
That's very interesting, meaning it's obviously so important to have lines and draw lines, but if someone slips a little bit, has a bit of a rough period, and he feels like he has crossed the line, what would your recommendation be to get back on your feet after that?
I mean, listen, I think it really depends on what that cross is, on what my advice would be. At the end of the day, you need to be true to yourself and you need to be comfortable that you are living your sincere life as a good yid. And so, yes, if you slip, you've got to find a way to get back on board and do it in a way where you minimize the damage. It's hard for me to tell you what I would advise or wouldn't advise because there's numerous scenarios that probably would go in different ways. Some it would mean being able to correct in your current job. Sometimes if you've crossed the line too hard, it may be difficult to correct in the current job and you may need to go somewhere else. So it depends on what the situation is.
Okay, and maybe one more question on this topic. You mentioned before that you sort of have to overcompensate and be working at 110% to maybe make up for, to be able to deliver the same results, even though you're not staying for the full Winter Fridays or the certain Chagim. So that's obviously makes perfect sense, Misvara. On the other hand, we think about our families and our other obligations outside of work. The baseline reality is that we're very busy at work and not have a lot of other time. So now you're telling me that in addition to sort of the baseline obligations, I sort of have to do extra to be able to, work more and overcome the fact that I'm not working at certain hours. So how do you recommend finding some sort of semblance of balance and availability for family and for Torah, even though we're all so busy with our work?
Um, so again, let's separate the question between investment banking versus non-investment banking, because most of the world is dealing with non-investment banking, which is a lot easier to balance and to be able to still put in 110%, still balance all the other aspects. Investment banking is a whole different world. So to me, if the question is how do you do it? You just have to be very clear on what your priorities are and make sure that if you understand what your priorities are, you're not wasting your time with Nourishkeit, with things that are going to take away from that time perspective. And then you just go down the list based on the priorities and you make time. Does, yes, maybe you're not going, and with question, people need to ask themselves, how many hours a day do I want to learn? What is my priority? Right. And I'm assuming for most of your listeners, davening 3 times a day, minyan, is a priority. So all of those should factor into what is your ideal job and how do you maximize that? Yes, there are times where you need to be flexible, but it depends on, is it long term, is it short term? And then how do you manage that? Baruch Hashem, I had a wife who was extremely um, understanding. And for us, it was about quality time and not quantity time. And we would find time, even though it wasn't necessarily always the ideal. Baruch Hashem, I had a chavrusa, a rav that I had learned with for many years, and we would make the time. And if matter was learning in the car ride home, that's when we would have a chavrusa, if it was 11 o'clock at night. So that's what I would tell you. And again, it's not one where somebody can give you a playbook. It's one of those that hopefully, if it's a priority, you constantly perfect.
Okay, great. So let's transition now to the sort of other part of the conversation that we wanted to focus on, which is the Torah of the Altar of Slabodka. Maybe just by taking a half a step back for a second, you had been already teaching for many years. So maybe you could tell us how you got into teaching business and then when you realized, had a sort of a eureka moment about the Torah of the Altar of Slabodka and its relevance to our topic today.
Sure. So I actually started teaching about 30 years ago when I first graduated from business school. A close cousin of mine was Nifter, and I decided I was going to go back to YU to learn in her memory before I went to investment banking. And while I was there, the dean said, why don't you come back and teach the case study method that you learned in business school and bring that to our students? So I started teaching in 1996, and I really, really enjoyed it. To me, it was not just what you were teaching, but it was the kesher with the students and trying to create better individuals and enhance their way of thinking. I then went to the business world and I didn't have a chance to come back to teaching until about 2015. And so to me, at that point, I was teaching entrepreneurial leadership, growing and managing a successful business in real estate. And so it was all about leadership and how to grow. During COVID, I remember I was in a outdoor minyan, and one of my neighbors, whose name is Avi, I'll leave his last name out because I don't know if you'd want me to mention it, came over to me and said, listen, I got an interesting question for you. I've looked into the Altar of Slabodka, and what I'm amazed at is his Talmidim have had a greater proportion of success in Gedolei Hadar than any other Rav. You think about Mir, Chaim Berlin, Tor V'das, BMG, Ner Yisrael, Chevron Yeshiva, Chafetz Chaim, Ponovich, and Rav Yitzchak Elchanan as well, YU. And so if you look at that and you say, from one individual having so many Rosh Yeshivas come from that individual. And he said, what was so unique from his leadership style that led to all those Rosh Yeshivas coming from the Altar of Slabodka, Rav Nassim Tzvi Finkel, as opposed to others? That set me off on a journey really trying to research and understand and figure out, because that is not something that just happens. And you think about all of those Rosh Yeshivas, and you think about all of those coming from one individual, that's extremely powerful.
So what were some of the results of that rabbit hole research? What were some of the big takeaways that you've started to teach to your students since that day?
So the first thing I would tell you is I believe in the first thing I want to just highlight. I'm going to highlight comparisons of good to great as opposed to good and bad. There are different views on Musar and non-Musar and different ways from a yeshivish, non-yeshivish. I'm just highlighting the great that I saw as opposed to comparing it and saying what it isn't is not necessarily bad, but I'm highlighting the good of what it embodies. And it's interesting because a lot of what I saw wound up tying together with a lot of business stuff that I learned at business school, whether that is a growth mindset, whether that's stuff similar to Jim Collins on good to great. I believe fundamentally, and I did not see this anywhere, but one of the fundamental things that I think had the Altar of Slabodka look at life differently is he was orphaned at a very young age. He wound up going to relatives in Vilna and took him in. And I think from a very young age, he realized that the derech eretz kadma Torah and being sensitive to people and understanding what it means to not being privileged is part of who we are as a yid, to not take things for granted and to understand individuals. So then I started really peeling the onion and really figuring out what was the Altar of Slabodka. Who was he? And, you think of some of the interesting quotes that I heard was that the Chafetz Chaim would say about the altar, I created books, he created people. Rav Kamenetsky would say, Rav Epstein was my Rebbe for Torah, but the altar was my Rebbe for life. And you start to think about, so what was so unique? What did the altar do differently? And so obviously the altar was in the Musar movement. And he was a Talmud of Rav Simcha Zissel, who was a Talmud of Rav Yisrael Salanter, but he had a twist on a difference of how he wanted to practice the Musar world. And so he always insisted that there was part of his Seder, of the Talmud's Seder had Musar, but there were some key themes that were key, and stop me at any time. One of the things that I would tell you was gratitude and hakaras hatov was so central to his daily life. I believe that goes back to when he was an orphan. The altar would talk about that the Adam HaRishons, the reason why he was thrown out of Gan Eden was because he wasn't Makir Tov. He said, Aisha Asher Nasat Ali, right? And so there was no hakaras hatov there. He also highlights with Moshe Rabbeinu on not striking the water because he was being Makir Tov and the water wasn't even in an individual. So he was very much focused on everyone is worthy of respect and you need to see everyone else as potential and appreciate that, which then led to one of the things that the altar was known by, which was Godless Adam, that everyone really has the potential to be a gadol. And that's something that I think was key.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here and a lot to talk about. So one thing that I wanted to ask you to expand upon a little bit is that you mentioned the origins being an orphan and being no privilege. So how does that apply itself to our reality? You're sort of my father's generation, so I grew up in a very, very privileged generation. Baruch Hashem, the infrastructure and the institutions and the parnasa that was built up by my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation growing up in America in the 90s and 2000s was really amazing and wonderful, but we were certainly under all definitions privileged growing up. So is there a way to sort of tap in to the mentality that he grew up in to really take nothing for granted, be gratitude for everything, being so emotionally in tune to what's going on, specifically because he had so little growing up?
Yeah, I would tell you two things. One, I think you need to make sure you get involved in chesed work where you see other people who are going through challenges. And it's not just cutting a check, but it's feeling their pain, feeling their challenges, because that will allow you to understand that you have what to be makir tov for, but also understand the challenges that other people feel. You need to be humble and you can't take things for granted. The second thing is on being makir tov, and I always like to tell this to people, gratitude is hodah. One of the shoresh of hodah and modeh have the same shoresh. In order to have hodah, in order to be thankful, you need to be modeh that you are missing something or that without that other person, you couldn't accomplish something. And so what I would tell you is there's so many opportunities for us to be makir tov that once you realize there are so many other people that you should be makir tov for, that helps ground you to be humble. And I'll give you an example. This past Shabbos, I was on an NCSY Shabbaton, and I was able to see over 50 makarvim interact with 200 public school kids who wanted to spend the week, their off week, getting closer to Yiddishkeit. And to me, it was just such a powerful thing to see these makarvim get these students to become closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so at the end of that, I actually sent individual texts. I dafka didn't do it via email because I didn't want everyone to think I was doing a mass email text one by one, being makir tov for what they do. And I think that's part of it, is realizing when you are makir tov, you take yourself down, you're humble, and you recognize that there are many people you need to be grateful for and you need to be thankful for. So to me, I think that's the key. You don't need to be in the situation, chas v'shalom, where you're an orphan or where you're deprived, but you can't take things for granted. You can't have gaiva, and you need to be humble. And I think that's where some of the lessons were.
I also really like, just to pick up on one of the sort of earlier things you mentioned, getting your hands dirty in chesed and really connecting to people who aren't as privileged. I really like that a lot. Do you have any advice for people who are looking for opportunities to do, real chesed? And when I say real chesed, I mean, all chesed is wonderful, but chesed that really sort of pulls you out of your comfort zone and really forces you to think a little deeper about what you have and others don't, and how to find those opportunities, and not maybe the, photo op chesed, which is also chesed, but not the same.
Yeah, I would tell you each person is different. You need to know what your strengths are, what you can do, and what you can't do. So for somebody who is a psychologist, obviously they can use that skill to others that are less than, don't have the means, and being able to guide them. To others that are more action oriented, you can do Tomchei Shabbos, you can do other things. I really think it's important. Yes, cutting checks is extremely important. And obviously, the more successful you are, the more you should be giving to tzedakah. But you need to find acts of chesed, and I say acts, not just giving, where you can actually roll up your sleeves. And it's important for two reasons. One, it's important for your well-being, but it's also important for your kids and your family to see that chesed is ikr to who we are, because that's what makes us better Yidden.
Okay, great. So you alluded to this practice of yours, and you've talked about this in other forums as well, of the individual messages, and I think it also connects back to the Godless Adam and the ability to connect to people. So you can tell us a little bit more about where that comes from and how extreme you are in this approach.
Yeah, I'm probably, my wife would probably say I'm on the extreme side of this. I truly believe being makir tov is something that we all have the power to do that so many of us don't. I'll give you an example. So when the emails that I got back, or the texts that I got back from people that I sent this past weekend, was just uplifting. It gives them more power to continue to what they do. I take that to an extreme. So after every chasna, after every simcha, and I don't recommend this, but I actually spend 2 or 3 hours after a simcha, and I write thank you notes to each individual who came to the simcha, because I want them to understand that they gave up 3-6 hours to enhance our simcha. And yes, very often in today's world, people do the easy thing, right? Which is the mass email, wishing everyone a good yontif, hope everyone thinking about you. But if you think about it, if you really want somebody to know you care, there's the mass email, then there's the more specific, and then there's the direct. Then there's, believe it or not, actually sometimes picking up the phone. And I will tell you, when you spend that extra time being makir tov, and it's not just in the Jewish world. I spent this last week writing over 1,000 New Year's cards to my connections in the business world, and I handwrite all of these cards. I do that because it's my way of being makir tov and staying in touch. And I do believe it's a very powerful tool that most people don't utilize to enhance relationships, but also it's just important on who we are.
So let's talk a little bit more about some other ideas. We spoke a little bit about Godless Adam. We spoke a little bit about emotional intelligence. So maybe tell us a little bit more about how those ideas have been central to your approach and to your teaching and to also your leadership as well.
Sure, and it actually ties back onto the Altar as well. So the Altar believed in Godless Adam, the potential of each individual. And what's interesting is that, in his view, we all have that potential to be successful. And when you have that view that each individual, the Altar would always say, I don't have 300 students, I have 300 individuals. For him, each person was that potential to be successful and to live in the paths that Hashem has set for us. There's no one size fits all, which is really important in today's world. He viewed each student, he wanted them to think and to rethink, and he wanted students to think deeply in their own unique ways, but without the gaiva. And so understanding that each individual has potential is a power that I think people don't utilize, both in education, limudei kodesh, and in limudei chol, and in the business world. When you go to somebody and say, I believe in you, I know you're going to be successful, let's get there, they're far more likely to get to where you want to go than when you just criticize or when you don't give them, you don't see their potential. Now, part of doing that ties into what we were talking about on emotional intelligence. Many of the yeshivas do an excellent job of focusing on IQ. But one of the things that I believe made the Altar successful, especially with his Talmidim, is recognizing that it's not just IQ, but it's EQ, the emotional intelligence side of it. Recognizing and understanding that how you manage your emotions, that better communication and empathy, conflict resolution, self-awareness, and self-management are all part of who you are as a person. And so it's interesting because the Altar of Slabodka was involved. He would monitor people's extracurricular activities and judge them by their character traits in order to make sure that they were placed in the right room so that they had the right match. It wasn't just about, all right, he's a great Talmud, he's going to room with somebody else, but it's understanding the person to get together with their EQ to understand what environment will they succeed in. His Talmidim would always say of him was that he was a master of human psyche and he knew which buttons to press. And in his mind, he was able to understand people. And because he was able to do that, he was able to convey that it was not just about what you learned in the Gemara, but it was how you were able then to take that and take the halacha, take the Gemara, and become a leader and impact other people. One of the things that he would do, which was different, was that they actually had a dorm. And you'd say if you had a dorm, you stay in your dorm all week and all Shabbos, and you'd be in that environment. And he said differently. He made sure that the students were comfortable in their dorms during the week, but on Shabbos and on Yontif, you go out to the community, you interact with others. And it was really important. And I think that was part of his specialness, was understanding that if you can marry EQ and IQ together, then you can get to success. And one of the other things about EQ was communication. And the Altar was and wasn't for strong communication. If you look at the Altar early on in his career, what made him stand out was he was a fantastic orator. However, as he grew into his role, he also understood the power of tone and who you were talking to, and he actually toned down his Musar shmuzim to be melatonin. because he didn't want to over convince somebody one way or the other. He wanted people to think on their own. But it was this understanding of EQ and IQ that I think fundamentally allowed him to have so many successful students.
So on the topic of Godless Adam and seeing the great potential in each and every person, it's somewhat easy to talk about that if you're talking about, a group of really smart students, and this one isn't sure if he should go into law or into business, and this one is a little bit has some self-esteem issues. But like, what if you have someone who comes to you, you're a student in university, or even a child in a family setting who, just doesn't seem to be that bright, maybe doesn't have a great work ethic, has other sort of issues, doesn't really seem to be on track for what we would classify as sort of normal success. So how do you see the Godless Adam and bring it out in such a situation?
Listen, I think, unfortunately today we put these labels on people and on things, and we have these boxes, and I think that is extremely unhealthy. I think the framework of Godless Adam is realizing that each person has potential. And that potential may be in a different way than we define what success is or isn't, but that each person has that ability to maximize their strengths. Some people are not as cut out to sit Yomam V'Laila in a base medrash. And maybe their tafkid is to be a tremendous balei chesed, to really get involved and to do other things that, could be what their tafkid is. Others, maybe their role is to be doctors and to heal people. So to me, what I would tell you is, I think it's really important for us not to put labels on people, but to really understand that Godless Adam is to understand that we all were created in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and that we all have the potential. There were 12 different shvatim, all 12 different skills. And it's to understand that different people have different skills. And if you're able to maximize their potential skill, that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu intended. So I just think it's important to put aside labels, because that's what Godless Adam is. Godless Adam is not meant for the Gvir. Godless Adam is not meant for this person or that person. It's every person truly has the potential to shine. And you think about it from a parent's perspective, right? You want to find the strength that your kid has and let them maximize. It's not your strength. And it's not the strength that everyone else may define of getting into this place or doing this. What are the strengths that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them? And maximize on those.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so maybe just a couple more quick questions before we wrap up. You mentioned the Altar's minhag to send the students out into the community. It sort of reminds me of the NCSY model. Some of the advisors who are, during the week are learning in yeshiva, and then they go out on weekends for Shabbatonim. So, there's this idea that, the difference between the Kinneret and the Dead Sea is that the Kinneret takes water but also gives it out. The Dead Sea takes water but doesn't give it over. So how important do you think that being able to not only just take Yiddishkeit and learn and intake information, but also be able to pass it on, teach, how is that relevant for Balbatim who are so pressed for time? But, is that something that people need to prioritize and find ways to have Torah, both coming in and going out, even though they're very busy?
So again, I think that is why the Altar had these Rosh Yeshivas, that today our Jewish world would be so different if the Altar didn't exist. And that's because it's awesome to be able to sit and learn Torah, but it's a whole different madrega when you can take it up a notch and teach it and convey it. And so, yes, to me, when I think about it, the Altar took, many times people would take their best Talmidim and keep them in their yeshiva. The Altar sent his Talmidim out in order to make sure they grew. And you think about it, the Mir Yeshiva tells, and some of the others, by the way, he sent his own son out, and that the Mir Yeshiva wouldn't have been the same without that. So to me, it's a matter of understanding that our tafkid as Yidden is not just to enhance our knowledge, but it's to grow others as well. When you talk about NCSY, yes, it's amazing what some of these individuals do. They give up of their moser nefesh of themselves in order to teach. And by the way, teaching can come in many different ways. It's not just about teaching halacha and Gemara, right? There are ways to do that in the business world. There's ways to do that in kiruv in so many other ways. So to me, that's what I would tell you.
Okay, before we go to our lightning round, one question which is pretty different from almost everything we've talked about up until now. I don't even think I've mentioned this to the Shark Tank audience yet, but I recently had a little bit of a shift in my professional life. And within the same organization, I'm not only doing sort of media and content and marketing, but I'm also doing fundraising in certain areas and certain spaces. So I'm wondering, as someone who's been involved in many nonprofits, advised nonprofits, donate to nonprofits, what your sort of big piece of advice for me to be successful in this new sort of hat that I'm now wearing?
Great question, and I think, listen, you've got to differentiate between the donors that you're going to go to just for a check here or a check there, and the donors that you want to get involved and you want to sort of get them really involved. And the way to get them involved is making sure that you're talking to what makes them sing. Listen, there are many good stuckas out there. And there are some that I get pulled to more than others. And what you want to try to do is find a way to pull that person in. I always like to say, if I can get a person to come on an NCSY Shabbos and to see the power of the change and see the power of what it means to have 20 non-from high school kids raise their hand and say, this is the first Shabbos I've kept for real, like that's power. So you just need to be able to find a way to engage people in what gets them going, but also understand that just because you may not sing to everyone, and so, okay, so you figure out a way to then get other people to donate. But that's what I would say is understand the individual.
Okay, certainly great to tie back to the themes that we've talked about the entire conversation. And I appreciate that. And thank you for that advice as I sort of start this journey. So thank you for that. So let's go to our lightning round. 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We're here in the winter. We have nice long Friday nights. What do you like to do at that time?
To me, this is an easy one. I say Tehillim every Shabbos. I've said it for the last 8 years. So when we have an early Shabbos, I try to say as much of Tehillim as possible because I've got many, in order to say all of Tehillim, if I can knock off it at night, it makes my day a lot easier.
That's very, very beautiful. And when we talk about, Parsha Shavua, the stories that come with us week after week, year after year, what's your go-to sefer to find some inspiration and insight into the weekly Parsha?
Weekly Parsha Torah Ladas has always been, it's an old faithful one, something that I had ages ago. So that probably is my old faithful.
Who wrote that? Not familiar.
Torah Ladas? It is. Hold on one second. It's a compilation of Divrei Torah. Let me just see who wrote it. Matis Bloom. It was written in 1985, and he's got a wonderful 5-volume set. It's a lot of nice inyana, both short and long.
Okay, and finally, if you were forced out of your current positions, both teaching and leading a business as a CEO, you were forced to join some new industry, some new role, something you'd never done before, maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid, what would that be?
I'm going to take the cop-out answer, and I don't think I would select anything differently. If you put a gun to my head and said you couldn't do what you're doing now, I don't know. I don't have something that I wish I was doing that I'm not. What would I say? I probably would say finding more time for more chesed is probably what I would say. But Baruch Hashem, I view every path that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has led me on, whether it's been good or bad, as the path that I was meant to go on, and I have tremendous amount of hakaras hatov for that.
Okay, Laizer Kornwasser, has been a fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks a lot. Take care.